And now it's time for a Q&A from you, the viewers. And our first question comes in from Ed Doyle, who is curious about the field programmable gate array chips we've been seeing a lot of lately here on the channel. Those are chips that are running on the Mister, which replicates a lot of old 80s and some early 90s game consoles, and also what we've seen on the analog Mega SG that we just talked about a few minutes ago that replicates a Sega Genesis. And of course we have the analog NT Mini, which was an NES clone console we looked at 2 years ago, and the Super NT from Analog, which did the Super Nintendo. And one of the things that Analog has done exceptionally well is make very accurate representations of the hardware that they're replicating, and they do that through the use of an FPGA chip. And the reason why these chips are so good for that purpose is that many old game consoles, like the Sega Genesis behind me, are very complicated in that they had a number of chips that were all working in concert together, and some of them were very different from each other. So in the case of the Sega Genesis, we've got an 8-bit Z80 CPU running along with a 16-bit 68,000 processor, and the Genesis was able to make all that stuff work together along with all the other chips that were running on it. And if you replicate all of that logic in an FPGA, the FPGA chip can actually process the logic in a very similar way the original console did, and that's something that is often very difficult to replicate exactly in a software emulator. And you can do it in a package that can fit into one of those tiny little consoles and can run off of what is essentially USB power, and that's very enticing for that kind of activity. However, that's about the best we can do with these classes of FPGAs at the moment, is replicating stuff from the 70s and 80s and early 90s. You can't do a PlayStation, for example, on the FPGA chips that are powering the Mister and the Mega SG, for example. You have to go up to much more expensive FPGAs to get close to that. And if you look at what goes on inside of a modern CPU and GPU that you'll find in a modern game console, you would need a huge FPGA that would cost quite a bit more than what you would be willing to pay for a game console to be able to make use of those chips in that way. Now, although gaming is a more recent use for FPGA technology, it has been around for quite some time, and because they are massively parallel, there's a lot of industrial uses for them. My TriCaster, for example, has an FPGA to be able to process all the video you see on screen right now in real time. Many cars have FPGAs in them to process all the data coming in from sensors, for example. There are countless areas where these chips are used, and because they are reprogrammable, if you have a bug that pops up after your hardware is released, it's very easy to update the hardware just by updating your FPGA code. But again, there is a price premium on these devices, and the more you want to do with it as far as complexity is concerned, the larger physically and the more expensive that FPGA chip becomes. And that, I think, will be why we won't see a lot of more complicated 90s consoles on FPGA anytime soon, unless there's some price breakthrough on those chips.
This channel is brought to you by the Lon.TV supporters, including gold-level supporters, the Four Guys with Quarters podcast, Tom Albrecht, and Kalyan Kumar. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to Lon.TV/support to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit Lon.TV/s.